a pagan. It comes out of paganism, and St. Nicholas was a combination of St. Nicholas of Myra. Myra is in what we call Turkey, and he was a bishop of a Roman Catholic church, and supposedly went around to houses with toys for little kids. Some believe he was a pedophile because he always had toys and kids around. Now, so what we're trying to say is that every one of these systems will have a culture, and it all came into the so-called Christian church through Roman Catholicism. And what I'm going to try to help you understand is that Israel got involved in all these. They all have a common source, Babylon. And Babylon, over here in Genesis 11 and 4, was founded on a doctrine called, let us make us a name. Let us make us a name. Now that's pride, that's self. That's the word name is the word Shem. It means instruction, or it means authority. Let's make up our own doctrine. And this was the beginning of Hercules. And Hercules was just another generic name for Nimrod, the man who conquered Babylon, who started Babel. The Babylonian system started Babel. And Nimrod was a grandson of Ham when he came out of the ark. And he started this system, and he was called Hercules and Tammuz, and he had many different generic names in all these different societies, Adonis, Attis, and the list goes on and on and on. Zoroaster. Their names changed as you would go in a different culture and different society. Well, and then all the female deities, and all the male deities were sun gods, the sun represented upon the earth by the fire. And the female deities, they held more power in the ancient world. More adoration was placed on the female than the male. You had Venus, and Venus was the grove, and this was the Tyrian Venus, or the Venus of Tyre, and the Tyrian Baal. And that's when Jezebel married Ahab and brought this system down into Israel. They began by adopting this system, and when they were carried off into captivity by Babylon, they got involved in all the gods of the Amorites and the Perizzites and all these different pagans when they came back to possess the land, when they were carried away. So all these nations had different names, different characters, but they were the same people. And the female deities were represented as the tree, as the moon, and had many representations, but they were all tree goddesses, and they were consorts. A consort is a partner god, or kind of like a roommate god, like one you live with. They were partners in cahoots with the sun gods, and most of the deity was placed upon the female goddess. She was also called Queen of Heaven, and that's the Mary of Roman Catholicism. That's not the Mary of the Bible. And the list goes, and the list is long. It just, every place you go, you got Ceres and Sybil and Diana of the Ephesians, and they were all the same god and goddess. All through the Bible. So there's only one sin in all the Bible. It's fire and tree worship. And when a man came up with this idea to invent a god, when they started this Babylonian system, all they did was merely duplicate the tree worship in the garden, tree worship, and the serpent worship. Of course, he is the one that talked to Eve. And you find that, and probably that's why the adoration was placed mostly on the female deities, because Nimrod and his mother, Semiramis, or sister, or he was always one or the other. He was always his mother or his sister, his wife. Sometimes he was marrying his mother, and they did that kind of thing among the pagans. Now, it is tree worship of the garden, and the pagans said, since the serpent enlightened men's minds, and that's when it happened in the garden, that they would worship the orb of the day, which was the sun. So, sun, tree, and serpent worship. And I pointed that out specifically because we're coming up on a day called Halloween. And Halloween comes out of Druidic worship. And what's amazing, how can you have something that exactly duplicates the Garden of Eden? The Bible says Babylon mothers it all, and Babel, when you study enough of these history books I study and these culture books, you'll see that Babylon, when let me put it this way, the Garden of Eden was the same place that Babel was in, the same exact place. Because when you look in the second chapter of Genesis, and you look at the rivers, and where Babylon was placed, it was placed over here, where the Garden of Eden was placed. The Garden of Eden, the rivers are the great river Euphrates, the great river of Egypt, the Nile, and then it has the Euphrates. They have other names, but the Euphrates and the Tigris, and there could have been some other rivers. I've seen some specials on TV on it, coming out of the Tigris and Euphrates. But it's believed the Garden of Eden was right down here. If this was Eden, now the Garden of Eden wasn't Eden. The Garden of Eden was the whole state. And that was the original boundaries of Israel. The original boundaries of Israel was in Genesis 15 from the great river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Now when the flood came, we don't know what it did to the plates and what happened to some of the rivers that were over here, but the basic boundaries of the Garden of Eden were the same as Israel. Israel's original boundaries went from at least the Euphrates all the way to the Nile River. That included all this Saudi Arabia, all of the Sinai Peninsula, all of Ethiopia, most of Egypt, all of Jordan, all of Israel, all of Syria, all of Lebanon. All this was Israel, and that was also the Garden of Eden by the description of the rivers. So if God planted a garden eastward at Eden, he planted right over here close to Babylon. Babylon is about 100 miles or so. How do you know that? Here's the statute of miles. About 100 miles or so. Here's the Tigris River coming down here. And it meets the Euphrates about 75 miles above the Persian Gulf. So they come together down here, and Babylon is just up the Euphrates 75 miles or so up here. So eastward in Eden, where the Garden of Eden was over where Babylon is. So when they had Babylon, when they said, let us make us a name, it's only common to pick up the relics or anything you find or any old temples. I read one writer, he said that after the flood they would build these temples that were shaped like arcs, and they have 8 figures in them. Well, if somebody run across that 200 years after the flood and they had them all over the place, then they're going to come up, they start worshiping something, it'll be that, or that'll bleed into the system, won't it? So it's only rational reasoning that makes you understand that if they said, let us make us a name, we'll make up our own doctrine, and a lot of the writers will say that was Adam and Eve worship that they started at Babel, and it was the tree worship. And that's the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree, the old pagans said all these female deities, Venus and Diana and all these, they said the tree deities were the giver of all divine gifts to men. That's the very words you get out of the 2 Babylons book. The giver of all divine gifts. Well, if it was the giver of all divine gifts, what did that tree in the garden have in it? Well, the Bible says all that's in the world, all in the world. Here's everything that a man lusts and covets after. Covetous means to want more, pleonectes, E-K-T-E-S, means want more. That's the word covetous. And covetousness is idolatry. So if you've ever wanted more, you're an idolater. God has to really take you through a lot of years to keep you from being an idolater and wipe idolatry out of your life. And then John says, 1 John 2, 16, 17, he says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that's in the world, here's everything in the world, everything that you lust after, and that you lust. Lust is epithumia. That's the common word in Greek. It means to long for that which is forbidden. Was that tree forbidden in the garden? Yes. And what did it have in it? It had all in the world, because What John said in 1 John 2:16, 17, all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, that's not of the Father, that's of the world. And that's what Eve saw in the tree in that 3rd chapter. She saw a tree that was good for food, it was pleasant to the eye, and it would make her wise. Wisdom is equated with pride. Self-wisdom. Philos, Philosophy, philosophy, or philosophos, Philo, philos, and Sophia.